I think, getting there and getting to the top of my field, I realized this isn't really what I want to do anymore.
In this episode of Sense Making Conversations, I'm joined by Farah Nasser, one of Canada's most respected broadcast journalists. She did something few people at the top are willing to do. She walked away. After 2 decades in journalism, with many successes behind her, and her most recent appointment to a national news anchor position, Farah made the choice to leave mainstream media. And it wasn't because she had any failures, but it was because she was choosing integrity. Sometimes success demands us to show up as a version of ourselves that we just don't align with. And that was exactly what was happening for Farah. This conversation isn't just about journalism. It's about what it costs to mask who you are to fit into a system that rewards neutrality over authenticity. Farah and I talk about the difference between facts and truth, a subject that we've explored a few times on this podcast. And in this conversation, we delve into the emotional toll that particular issue takes. The toll of having to stay impartial, and the moment Farah decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. We've all had moments like this in our careers where we felt like we were performing a version of ourselves for the sake of a job that no longer fits us. And maybe you've wondered what it might feel like to step out of that role and into your authentic self. If that's the case, and maybe you're experiencing that right now, this episode is really going to resonate for you. I'm Andrea Sampson, and this is Sense Making Conversations. Please join me in welcoming Farah Nasser. Farah, you have been a fixture here in Canada on many of our television sets as the national news anchor for a very large national network. And you made a choice to step away from that. And I know that choice, these are never easy choices to make, of course. But your choice came from a place of being in your truth, in your authenticity. And I know that it got to a point for you where you felt that this role of being this national anchor wasn't allowing you to really be authentic and real with who you are. Being a news anchor, being a journalist required you to mask. What did that cost you? And help me to understand how you came to that and what it is you hope to do by stepping away.
So it was something that was actually years in the making. Like I think when I left, people thought it was just kind of a decision that was made on the fly. It was there was a lot of job loss at our network, at every network. There's so many layoffs and things like that. But it's something I've been thinking about for years. In fact, probably from the when the pandemic started winding down, and I felt like I was in a very inauthentic job. So being a news anchor, you have to be impartial, unbiased. You have to kind of, I was very good at sitting a certain way, saying a certain thing. And I was always told that I wear my feelings sometimes. The one criticism from consultants and all kinds of people who would, watch my tapes, and executives would always say, you wear your emotion on your sleeve. Like you have to kind of rein it in, be more stoic. And as I got higher in my field and, when you're a national anchor, that's kind of what you have to be because you have to appeal to everybody. You have to appeal to all kinds of audiences. So, I think, getting there and getting to the top of my field, I realized this isn't really what I want to do anymore. And I don't even know if it was what I wanted to do in the first place. I started in television when I was 17. I was on the Rogers Community Television, and my career just accelerated from there until I, became the anchor of one of 3 of Canada's national newscasts. But getting to that peak, I looked down and thought, "This isn't what I want. It doesn't feel like me." And I think it's because I'm somebody who's real, who doesn't kind of, put on a front, and I was finding it harder and harder to be real, to be my real
Mhm.
self. I was kind of being told to not be as emotional. I did some interviews that were really heated, and one in particular didn't air because they thought I was being too heated,
Wow.
in that interview. And it wasn't about being heated. It was about getting the truth, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so I feel like there's been times in my career where, um, I've been kind of told to not be myself essentially. And, you get older and you realize you start feeling really good about yourself, right? In your
Mm,
40s, I'm
yeah.
sure in your 50s as well. And
Yeah,
you start really loving yourself. And when you get to that point and you're like, no, no, you're wrong. Like I'm good.
yeah,
This is who
yeah.
I am. And I think once I hit that switch, I was like, no, I'm good. And people were shocked. They were like, you're so, but and it was great for the viewers and I had a really high profile and a really, really powerful job, but I didn't wanna do it anymore. I didn't wanna sacrifice who I was and telling the stories that I really wanted to tell, particularly in the past year with the war in the Middle East,
Mhm.
and that really kind of changed things for me.
I listen to you and I think I mean, first of all, as a journalist, it must be difficult in that you're not, they're not your words that you're saying, so that you're being given words, right? Like there is a script that's being given. You're reading from that script. Sometimes you are asking your own questions and being your, you know, having an inquiry. But the challenge, of course, is that it's the separation of the human from the journalist. The job requires you to do that to some degree. And we're living in a world where journalists are, becoming less and less authentic. They're choosing personas or specific sides in many cases, and staying to those party lines. And I think it's one of the things I admire about you is that you made the choice not to do that, to step away from this role. But being a journalist is such powerful and important training because it is about getting at the truth. Like you said, you're doing interviews where you're trying to get at the truth.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that we talk about here a lot in sense making conversations is the difference between a truth and a fact. And these are very different things. And facts, are something that we can all empirically see, but how we perceive those facts, of course, is tainted by or tinged by how we see the world and how we choose to be in the world. And as a journalist, you're supposed to be objective. That's your job. And so tell me about that. Tell me about sort of, your role. And again, not just as a journalist, because you're stepping away from that. And I think you're living a truth that many women are now living, right? And have been living for many, many years. And as a female journalist, you were probably held to a little bit of a different standard. And I think some of that authenticity that we spoke about earlier was there. But tell me about that from where you are now versus where you were as a journalist. Truth versus fact.
So let me correct you on one thing first. So that the copy that's given to me in terms of the writing and the interview, so those are my questions, especially during interviews, and
Okay.
even our writing. I mean, the writers will write, and then I
Right.
will reshape what I'm saying. But at the same time, you're only giving a certain slice, right, of what's
Right.
happening. So the our national newscast was like 22 minutes with the commercials, 30 minutes, and in that time, the words I say are picked so carefully, right?
Right.
And so I'll write them, then somebody will be like, "Well, you can't say this, you can't say this isn't r this will get us in trouble,
So
this will
it's
do
curated.
this is gonna." Yeah, and it's exhausting, right? It's
Yeah,
exhausting
I'm
because you just
sure.
wanna tell the truth, and
Yeah.
and you wanna tell the facts, actually. So, I think going back and thinking about how, I don't think I didn't feel as brave as I did when I first started my career in the past couple years,
Yeah.
where there was real worry of pushback and offending one side or a lobby group coming at you or things like that. And that to me is the crux of what journalism is. It's facts, right? And like you
Mhm.
said, truth. Truth is
Or it's
different.
supposed to
Your
be.
truth is different from my truth. We see things a
Right.
different way. The idea of being impartial is essentially a fallacy because you are human first, right? You're seeing things in a different way. But when you talk about facts and when you talk about facts that are out there that people are like, oh, well, if you put this fact beside this fact and this tells this and that kind of thing, like that's is a bit problematic for me. So that gets to a point where it's like, this doesn't feel right. And certain things were not feeling right.
Yes.
So it's just it was like that for a few years before I left. And so I think to me, my integrity and my what I want in my life and how I live my life and how I present myself, I hold myself to a very high standard. And so when I feel like I couldn't completely be myself and do things with the integrity and the ethics that I have been brought up with and that I have, been brought up with even in my career, right? Then I started getting a little bit concerned with how things were going. And not to say that journalists and all the networks are doing the journalists are doing amazing work. Like, they are really ethical, incredible journalists
Mhm.
in Canada. But for me, being a news anchor, I found that challenging. It didn't sit right with me after a while.
Yeah, and I mean, the way you describe that, like you write what you want to say, then of course it's got to go through levels
Mhm.
of so
Vetting.
vetting and saying we can say this but not that, and to some degree it starts to change the meaning of what you've written, or it leaves out critical pieces that perhaps without that background, some of it doesn't always hang together. And so, what we're talking about is like facts and data points, right? It's like, and really we're using these two things almost interchangeably, and they're not. Um, so, and I agree with you. I think our Canadian journalists are there's a lot of integrity within our
Mhm.
Canadian journalism, but that isn't always true across the board.
No.
And so when we think about what we are being fed, and you know, journalists, I mean, this is one of the biggest challenges is that we've got those journalists who are working within institutions that are very credible. But then we have people who are on platforms like this, on po- podcasts, or on social media, and they're using facts, data points, perceptions, truths interchangeably. How do we help others start to understand how to listen for what is a truth versus a fact? Because I think we need to learn this because
Mm,
we have been socialized since at least I was a child that if you hear it on the news, it must be true.
yeah.
And I don't think that's the case anymore.
I have found there's a difference in different newscasts. Like, I've seen standards. I've worked at every news station in the country, right? So all the big ones. And there is a difference between ethics and standards and the way that the journalistic practices and principles are. I mean, I'll let you decide that for yourself, but you should look at, like, all these things are public, right? How
Mhm.
they report, what they report, it's work. But to see where people stand, you can really tell that through their guidelines, their journalistic guidelines,
Mm.
and how they work. So I think it's hard. It's hard even for me. I think the easiest way to do it is to get multiple perspectives. So
Yeah.
don't just listen to one newscast, listen to many newscasts. And also, always ask yourself where this presenter is coming from, where this journalist is coming from. Is there a motivation there? Who is this company owned by? Like, these kind of questions we have to ask. We didn't
Yeah.
have to ask before. This was not a question that I ever thought of, that I
Yeah.
ever thought I'd be saying before. But you have to really be skeptical about everything. And I'm not just talking um about the big journalism companies, because I or the big news companies, because I do believe that they have much higher ethical standards than somebody who just calls themselves a journalist. I think you have to be worried about people like that. I think you have to
Yeah.
worry about people saying facts when they don't have the background, when they haven't done all the research. I think you have to, for anybody who's giving you information, you need to be a journalist on that person. So even me
Yeah.
saying something, you have to think back. Why would I be saying this? What's my background? You have to be skeptical with everything, because unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And
Mhm.
with AI and everything, just kind of everything changing so fast that, it gives us whiplash. It's hard to really know what's true and what's not true. So I think that's the best way to do it, to get multiple sources and multiple information. And then you see, like, if there's this certain fact and you see that it's been in, 2 or 3 or 4 publications, maybe you do some your own research, and you look up in deep AI, GPT or whatever, deep research, and you look at where it came from.
Came from, yeah.
So it's a lot of work to now watch the news. It's not as easy as it was, unfortunately, and I wish there was a quick solution, but there isn't.
Yeah, and it's not just the news. I mean, look, our facts are coming from everything from our government representatives to the schools that we're sending our children to
Mhm.
the to the conversations we're having around dinner tables. I mean, I think, to your point, information has never been more readily accessible and available. We don't have to wait for the 6 o'clock news or, the morning newspaper to find out what happened.
Yeah.
We find out real time. And of course we find out six different versions of it all at once. And to your point, like it's the curation of that of what do I believe? What do I see as being true? And I think that this is, we're living in a world of we often hear it described as transparent or radical transparency. and
Mhm.
and and in some ways it feels anything but because it's really hard to discern. And yet, those of us who have a real desire um to help others make sense of what's happening, it gets challenging. And so that's where we have to almost come back into ourselves and say, who am I and what can I offer? And what is my authentic self in terms of what I offer in the world? And I know that this was part of it for you of wanting to take that newsroom mask off, take the curated words off and be open. And so, as you step into the authentic Farah, um, who she's becoming today. What are you noticing about yourself, but also the world and how you perceive it now versus what it looked like when you were in that world?
I feel like the world today is bringing out the worst in all of us, to be honest. Like, I just think, things were moving at such a warp speed, and then we're, like, inundated with all this bad news, not once a day at the supper hour newscast, all day, like you said. And we're also expected to meet these impossible standards, right? Comparing, our behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. So it's just we're in this place where vulnerability feels like a liability, and I think
Mm,
that is a problem, because I think if we see the world like that, then we see, mistakes as failures rather than growth opportunities. So when we are able to be our true selves, I think we can be more energized, right? Like, I think of it like swimming against a current. Like, I feel like that's what I was doing. I was staying afloat, but every stroke was a struggle.
mhm.
Whereas now, I feel like I'm swimming with my authenticity current, and it's invigorated me in all these different ways. The
Mhm.
energy that I have, the excitement I have, the stories I want to share. Like, I feel like a different person in a way. That was kind of shackled
Mhm.
almost, and I think free is the best way to describe it. I feel free to be myself, and it's the best feeling, and it's made me a better wife, a better mother, a better daughter. Like, I just all around as a human, I feel better, and, I'm much more confident in who I am.
Well, what I find really interesting about that too, like, so here you are as a journalist swimming against the current, exhausted because it is exhausting. And that colors, of course, the way in which you see the world. Without that, with the renewed energy, with this, ability, like, what do you see differently now? What is it, through these I'm not gonna say rose-colored glasses because I don't think they are. I think you're
Mm.
probably now seeing the world in the way that is the most authentic to who you are and to what you wanna create, because I deeply believe that how we choose to see what's around us shapes what we create in the world. And so, as you are now sort of looking up and out with this renewed, vision of the world, what are you creating? What do you see? And what are you most excited about?
I'm it's funny to say this, but I'm excited to age, because I feel like every year I just feel happier and more confident in who I am, and I think what I've noticed the pressures that we're under, not just women are under, we are all under right now, right? This like imposter syndrome that we all live with, or this idea of perfectionism, like all these things that I look back on when I look at old pictures of myself, or I see in other women who are where I was maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. And I feel like I see it in a different way. And I think that's allowing me to really tap into a different side of myself. To be able to kind of get into this thought leadership space. And I think also being an interviewer, you develop this real keen, spidey sense, right? When people are not being real with you, you can tell right away.
Of course.
Um, and when you think about why they're not being real with you, I think people are under pressure. I think they feel pressure, whether it's political correctness, whether it's that they're not good enough. I think there's just so much pressure to be vulnerable in our society, and we're so scared of saying that we've made a mistake. And I love making mistakes. I think it was my kid's grade 2 teacher said that, "Yeah, every time you make a mistake, your brain grows." And I never
Mm,
understood that when she said that. I mean, I kinda got it, but now I really get it, right? Like, I in this past year, I've I've taken some opportunities that I'm like, why did I waste time doing that?" Like,
yeah.
and I'm okay with that. I don't see that as a failure anymore. I would have seen that as a failure. If I had a bad interview with the prime minister, I would have been like, "Oh, devastated, going to therapy talking about it, worried, thinking I was, like, a horrible journalist." But I feel like I can now reframe that. I see things in a different way. I'm like, "This is great that this happened. This is what's gonna happen next time. This is what I learned out of it." And
Yeah.
I wish that other women could see things that way, that we don't have to be perfect.
We don't have to be perfect. Yeah, I as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, we run into these, failures and setbacks and all of these things often. And one of the things that I kind of came to recently is that, and I say this all the time now, which is failure means you just took score too soon.
Right.
Like just keep
Yeah.
going, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is when we get into vulnerability, and I think it's interesting that we sometimes conflate vulnerability and failure, right? That
I know.
that these two things, and especially as women, because vulnerability, we've been taught that to be vulnerable is to be weak. And I don't believe that. I actually believe that being vulnerable is a choice of strength.
I think it's a
Um,
powerful tool. Like, I think it connects you with other
Absolutely,
people, right? It gives
absolutely,
it gives the other person permission, right? To say,
yeah.
"I can be vulnerable too, and I'm not gonna judge you for this," right? So I think there's a re I wish that we could reshape it in a way, and, like, I have so many girlfriends. I'm lucky to surrounded by a great support system and a lot of, wonderful people, but I have a lot of friends who also still feel like they have to put a mask on, right? And it's exhausting. Like,
Oh god, yeah.
I feel like I have so much more energy right now, like,
Yeah.
it's almost the lazy way to be in a way, to just be yourself and not have to always be on, and it feels so great.
It feels great, and I think that, the openness, the vulnerability are really important. And I think that, but there are lessons to be learned within that because, we see, to your point earlier about you can always tell when somebody's holding back or not quite telling the full truth.
Mhm.
But I think we also get people who are trying to be vulnerable and they're doing things like trauma dumping or, weaponizing
Right.
vulnerability, which, that's not good either. But, I think if we can find that place of true vulnerability where we're showing up as who we are, knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know.
Yeah.
And being okay with both of those things and recognizing that, look, every person that is listening or talking to us or in our experience has had a life that has challenged them in some way, like none of us get out of this easy. Like even the person who's
No.
got what seemingly is the best life. And so when we are in leadership roles, I think this is where it gets interesting
Mhm.
because in leadership roles, what often happens is that idea of vulnerability becomes dangerous or it moves into these territories where you use it
Mhm.
to, like I said, weaponize it. But how do leaders get comfortable using their vulnerability? I mean, this is what, as a journalist, you were a leader. And I think you were probably more comfortable with most in using your vulnerability. And
Mhm.
in the end, maybe it didn't work for those who wanted you, but it did work for you.
Mhm.
So
And
how do you what advice would you give to leaders to work with and leverage or be authentic to that vulnerability?
I think people have to be self-aware. I think that's the cornerstone to it. I think self-awareness is not just, understanding who you are, but kind of understanding your human operating system, right? So what are your values? What are the things that you, maybe think are your priorities or your thoughts, but they're actually sometimes you mistake these thoughts for facts, right? Like you
Right.
think, you make these judgments and you're like, this is how it is. So I think unraveling all of that to understand who you really are, what you're really thinking, I think is the key part of it. I think vulnerability we've talked about is another key part of it. I think the active listening part of it is really important. So, turning off your internal monologue when you're talking to somebody without expecting something in return is really important. And I think in the end, it's all about creating trust, right? So once you can understand yourself, you can admit your mistakes, even in the hard times. Like I think, I was talking to my mentor. She's working with an AI company, and she was saying how the head of the AI company was saying, told their staff that, look, your job's going to be taken in 2 years. You're not going to have the job that you have. It's the truth. I'm not going to lie to you. So here's our choice. We can all, as a company, kind of work for what's next, and we can all upskill, and we could help you, and we can all, or if you want to do this exact same job, it's not going to be available. So enjoy it for the next 2 years. You have a choice. Treating people like adults, I think, is really
Yeah.
important. On TV, you're managed a lot. Like you're always
Right.
told, "Oh, you look so pretty," or "That's a great dress on air." And and when you're young, you're like, "Oh, they like me," and then you're like, "Okay, okay, I think
Yeah.
you get so used to be. It's so irritating." And I've always thought that and I had some managers who treated me like an adult and kind of brought me in. And I think when you bring people in, they become loyal to you and they want to do more for you, right? And I think that trust has to be there.
And so, when we think about that, we look out into the world and look, these last few years have been tough, right? Like everything
Yeah.
from, the pandemic to so much political upheaval to
Mhm.
now getting into AI, AI, whether it be threats or opportunities. I think it's many people will tell you something different.
Yeah.
And we are all living in this same world, but I'm not sure that we're all sharing the same reality.
Mm.
And, for you, as you look out into this world, both as a former journalist and now as you step into a thought leadership role, um, what's your take on this shared reality that we maybe or maybe not actually have?
I think that comes down to I did a whole TED talk on this, but before the pandemic, I think it comes down to intellectual humility. So I think it's really, when we're journalists, when we go to a scene, we're the most uninformed people, right? We have to become experts really quick. And the best way to do that is to be a don't know it all, right? To go there and just say what you don't know. And I think if we as leaders can say, I don't know, I think I know your experience, I don't actually know your experience. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that even when we have these conversations, we assume we know what we want to get out of them. But if we're really listening, we might be getting something totally different out of that. So having that true humility when you're having conversations and when you're being a leader to say, I think I understand 3 rungs down from me, but I don't actually get what they're doing. I don't really know what they do all day. You know what I mean? To really be
Oh,
honest with that and then try to understand that in a real, true way. It's appreciated.
absolutely. I mean, that kind of openness, I think, is important. Understanding where each other is coming from as well. Because I
Mhm.
think, as you were saying earlier, like it's starting off by saying, What do I know about that person, that institution, that whatever it is that I'm interacting with, and what can I know so that when I'm hearing what they're saying, I'm hearing the context of why and how they're saying it and what they believe. And
Mhm.
so I think that that shared reality, of course, is colored by the context from which each of us is coming, and I think, when we look at our world right now, borders are being erased, wars are being waged.
Mhm.
And so we have both of those things as being true. And it makes it difficult to know context and that sort of that cultural identity that comes in to color what we're seeing. And so it gets hard to understand what is our shared reality and how do we learn from each other in a way that allows us to have, I think, a little bit more patience with each other, and
Mhm.
while at the same time getting a deeper understanding, and I'm gonna come back to that word, of facts, not truths, because that's really, what the shared reality should be based on, and yet it's the facts or it's the truths that we tend to argue. And
Yeah.
so yeah, go ahead.
No, I know. I was just thinking like it's easy for me to say all this stuff and be all kumbaya about it, but in reality, it's not easy when you're, in a conversation with maybe you're not a Trump supporter, but maybe your boss is, or maybe you're um or on one side of the war in the Middle East on Gaza and you're or somebody's on the other side, right? Like it's really hard to have these things. But I think the thing is, like you said, it comes down to facts. And so you're going to have there's like a spectrum of people. You have people on either sides that won't believe the actual facts. Those people, I've actually, and this is something also as I've gone into thought leadership, I thought everyone, we're all going to have to understand each other, but you're not going to understand. To me, I'm like, okay, this 10% here, 10% there, it's not going to, there's nothing we can do. But I think it's that 80% to really understand where people are coming from that we need to focus on. Because the majority of people don't want animosity. They don't want to fight.
Yeah.
They're kind people who want to understand where the other person's coming from. So it's those people that we have real conversations with, and two things can be true at the same time, right? Like,
Mhm.
the Jewish community can feel like they are under attack. Anti-Semitism is up. They have lost family members to the Holocaust. They have a real fear that this could happen again to their culture, their identity, their livelihoods, their lives. And then you have these atrocities happening in Gaza where innocent children, innocent people are dying, and our leaders are not brave enough to do enough. So these things are true. They're both true, and they
So
both are
true.
allowed to coexist. It's not like one has to win over the other, right? So I think if we look at that and we find that 80% mushy middle of people, we can actually have these conversations. But when you have those people that are at the other ends, you just have to me, like, and that's the other thing I've learned. I'm like, I just can't, there's not much I can do there. Like, I'm
Well, and I think you bring up a great point because the reality is, and if we think about what we hear, on a regular basis, I think it's from the either 10%, either end.
exactly, they're the
Right?
loudest.
We don't hear that 80,
Mhm.
and and so that 80% in the middle, like you said, they're not out there screaming. It's the 10% on either end,
Mhm.
and because of that, um, we get this perception that it's everyone, and it's not. And so when we look at that mushy middle, as you describe it, I mean, I think this is where we need more voices, where we need more people stepping up and talking about the fact that yes, two things can be true at the same time. And that we want to come together, not create division. That we're not afraid, that we're actually feeling confident in some ways. And that, these are things that don't get said enough, I think, and that don't get reported because quite frankly, they're not interesting. And
Mhm.
yet, these good news stories are the places where I think the most growth and learning, because this is where vulnerability lives. This is where connection is. This is where authenticity is. And when we choose to go into that mushy middle, I do think that there's interesting things, but we're just not looking for them. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's the loudest voices on either side that just kind of monopolize every conversation, and that's very problematic. But the truth is, in reality, I think people I think we're surrounded by wonderful people, like really good people who
Yeah.
wanna understand other people's point of views. And I think, when I see this in my keynote that I give, like I tell my story, I tell so many personal stories, and like the amount of people who are like, just, you're really vulnerable up there on stage sometimes, and you
Yeah.
say things, and the way it hits people, like, it's not their lived experience, but they feel like they're like, "I had something similar," or, "This reminded me of this
Mm.
time," right? And you give people permission to be like, "It's okay." And I'm not talking about oversharing or being unprofessional at work or anything like that, but
No.
I'm talking about, like, the reality that, like, for example, the reality that mothers go through or women who are going through menopause who wanna leave their careers when they're at their peak because
Yes.
they can't handle it. And, and it's a biological phenomenon. Like, it's like this kind of stuff. Like, why don't we talk about these things? Like, why
Yeah.
aren't we honest? And I think that to me, that honesty is so key. Like, I think
Yeah.
we have to be honest and we have to be accepting of people who are honest. And like you said, it's not like, going through therapy in real time on Instagram.
No.
That's maybe a different thing. But,
But there
you
are
know,
lessons in there,
yeah.
I mean, you just reminded me as you were talking, I grew up in the '80s and the '90s, and it was a time when women were first being invited into the boardroom, and
Mm,
and what was interesting about that time, in history was that yes, we were being invited in, but we had to we had to perform and look like men, we had to wear the big shoulder pads and the
mhm.
the
Mhm.
boxy suits, and often we're told to sit and say nothing because we were just lucky to be at the table, and truthfully we felt lucky to be at the table. And yet, we had something to say. And I think today, as a completely different place, like we're not there anymore. Those were important times because they had to happen, and they did, and we it got us to where we are now. But as we think about this, and I love that you've brought it to storytelling. I mean, one of my favorite things.
Mhm.
And stories are what actually help us to bridge that cultural context, to understand and find the meaning inside of things that we are trying to articulate in ways that often we can't either find the words or the emotions for, but yet the story allows us to bridge that. And so when we go to story and authenticity and we build vulnerability, like where do you see us going? Like, is this something, you've made a bold move as an individual, and that bold move, I'm sure, has impacted your family, it's impacted your friends, it's probably even impacted to some degree the nation because you were impacted the nation.
Mhm.
Um, where do you think we're going? There's going to be more people like you making these bold moves.
Well, yeah, I think they're already happening. Like, you look in the States, you look at a lot of the big anchors, like, they've left, right? They've left,
Yes.
they've either started their own or they've gotten out of the business. Like, some of the top anchors in North America have left, and it's to me, I think this authenticity is going to shape our future. I mean, the leaders of the future are gonna be rewarded with meaningful relationships with employees that are excited to be at work. We have a burnout problem right now. We have a disengagement problem right now. I think it's all related to this. And I think this generation of workers, this new generation, so younger than me, they are demanding real leaders. They don't want just a paycheck. They want a purpose, right? And they
Mhm.
want people who they align with, right? And who they can believe in. And they're the generation who they didn't take things at face value, right? They've seen, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They've seen things like, they've seen what's happened over COVID and climate change and what we've been told and what's really happening, So they don't take things just as we tell them that. They need to really trust you and believe in you.
Mm.
And that's why there's a trust deficit. And that's what I think can be solved if people are just take off that mask and are able to be themselves in leadership and are able to see, problems as growth opportunities without stigmatizing the person that's at the center of them.
You know, uh, what you just said there, like we have a trust deficit and we need to rebuild it.
Mhm.
And we're in the middle of, a poly crisis. We hear this all the time. So what do you think it's gonna take to rebuild the trust ecosystem? Is it more and more people leaving things like journalism, which have been our trust
Yeah.
institutions? Is it leaders becoming more vulnerable? What is it, in your opinion, that is needed in the world today so that we can rebuild a trust ecosystem so that middle, that 80% can feel good every day about where they are?
Well, we've seen it in politics, right? We've seen people who are, I mean, you take Justin Trudeau as an example, right? Um, he came across in 2015, this charismatic leader. I mean, I interviewed him when he was running in Papineau. I spent weeks with him on the campaign trail, and it was his charisma that attracted people, right? And then when people started feeling like they saw the real him, and that he wasn't being real, that's when it kind of went down. So we're seeing this in leadership success. Authenticity won Donald Trump the election. It wasn't his ideas. It was that people felt like he was real. Agree with him or
Real.
not,
Yeah.
hate him or not, his version of real, whatever that is, right? So we're seeing this type of authentic leadership win, right? And we're seeing
Mm,
that old generation of like corporate rock star baby boomer leaders, that's out. So
right.
I think it's a generational thing that we're seeing that's changing. And I think that, once I think leaders can be comfortable with that, I think they will get those employees back. The ones that are feeling disengaged, that are feeling disenfranchised, that are unheard. I think these sanitized workplaces that we live in now, because we're so scared to offend, I think that's gonna go. But I really believe, and that's why I'm doubling down on this. Like, that's why this is
Yeah.
really what I believe. I really believe in my career, I have seen careers crumble when authenticity is sacrificed. I've
Yeah.
seen it happen. So I think we're in a new kind of wave of leadership. And
And
I just one quick thing to point out, and Gabor Mate talks about this a lot. I'm not sure if you know who he is. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So he talks about also how, like, physiologically, how having a mask on, what it does to us, right? how it leads to autoimmune diseases, how it leads to stress,
Yes.
how it leads to stress sleep. Like there's a real connection between having to always be on and what's happening internally with us. And when there's a disconnect, you see it physiologically. I've seen it physiologically. That's some of the stories I tell in my keynote. And so I think we're just gonna have to kind of figure out a way to and as simple as it sounds, but to be our authentic selves.
Unpacking what you've just said, like, I'm sort of struck by this concept of Donald Trump won the election because he was authentic. And you're 100% right with that, right? Like him or not, agree with him or not, what whether and I don't know if he was truly being authentic, but that's how he's perceived, right? The perception is this is a man who is totally saying exactly what he believes, whether we like it or not. And and has that attitude. I don't care if you like me. I don't care, you know, I'm authentic to me. And I think that this is a lesson that so many of us have to learn again and again and again because
Mhm.
we have been told, don't be authentic. Hide yourself. Hide behind that mask. If you're broken, don't show it. If you disagree, put a smile on.
Right.
And these are the lessons that have to be removed from our society now because we can see through them. We're not willing to live a lie anymore.
Yeah.
And especially in our politicians, I mean, we elect officials to represent us and we want to believe that they are going to do what's best for us. And yet, if they've got that slick politician face on, how can we trust them? And that's the key, right? That is the key right there. I interviewed, a couple of weeks ago somebody, Corey Lopez, Warfield, who was talking about the concept of co-governance, which is using an AI-driven, ledger-based tool that, provides in the moment decision making for political leaders
Hmm.
to enact at a global level. And it is an interesting point because there you need then a person who you trust because now you've got the human who's enacting the digital the digital consensus kind of thing. And so I think this is a really interesting concept that you know authenticity is the only way forward because as humans, we've progressed far too much in terms of being able to see through the masks,
Mhm.
and we're not naive anymore. We're just
It's not like
not.
it was a generation ago, and I think the other thing is imagine how much it can unlock, right? Like the ideas that are being kind of people that are being unheard or undervalued, right? And even like if you're it's funny, there's this like tragic irony with diverse leaders, right? Who are hired to bring
Yes,
their perspectives, so the companies say, but then they fit this mold because they don't want to,
right.
bring their perspective because they're scared they'll be reprimanded for it. So there's all these ideas that exist right now, but that aren't being shared, that aren't being amplified. And just to kind of further the point, like I've interviewed, I mean, Nobel Prize winners, CEOs, thought leaders, all kinds of people, Olympians, Hollywood stars, prime ministers, presidents, and behind every fancy title is a human just as uncertain as the rest of us. You know,
Absolutely.
people are really good at faking that they know everything, but honestly, most of them don't, like everyone's just kind of getting by and getting through the day. And I've seen mediocrity and brilliance in equal measure. I really have in the interviews that I've done over my career. And I find that we just feel like everybody else has it figured out. And all those people we think have it figured out, they're thinking, can these people see through me? You know?
Yep.
So I think if we're real about what we don't know, I think it can unlock all kinds of potential.
Well, that comes back to, the concept of, what we were talking about earlier with this failure, right? Like, is it failure or is it just simply an opportunity? You said like, and we've all heard this, it's a learning opportunity. But I think there's
Yeah.
when you go a bit deeper with that, when we add in authenticity and we say, look, I know something, you know something, the way in which we got to know these things were from different angles as a result, even though we may know the same thing, we know it differently. And because
Mhm.
of that, it can actually, just by knowing the same thing differently, allows us to open up new opportunities to go further. Like, And that's what happens when we choose to come together with the differences that each of us bring. And that's important. That's the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience, diversity of culture. These are all things that actually create opportunities for growth.
Right.
And we're in a world where while the bottom and top 10% are screaming loudly, I think the middle really wants it and is open to it and
Mhm.
is creating opportunities for us to really show up much more authentically and vulnerably. I want to hand it back to you, Farah, for last words, because I think this conversation has taken us in a lot of different places. And I think what I've gotten from it is that we're beginning to, through an authentic approach, restore, our ability to have agency within our world, to rebuild some of those trust ecosystems. And we might be at the very beginning of it, but at least we're starting. And I think part of that started with your exit from journalism,
Mm.
because I think it's the journalists who are sort of at the brunt of this. And as you leave and as others leave with the choice of I want to be authentic and I want to be vulnerable, it sets a path for the rest of us. So I want to hand it back to you and say, what would you like to leave our listeners with, and how can they stay in touch with you?
Think that journalism is still a really powerful tool. Like, I think I left journalism, but I think there's some journalists who are still doing incredible work, and I think journalism is still very important as a facet to democracy. I do think that as consumers of news and consumers of information, we have to be um, a lot more sophisticated and educated on what we're consuming and what we take as fact, right? In terms of what's offered to us. I think we need to get diverse perspectives, but that is also me admitting to you that I don't know where this is going to go. I really don't know how journalism is going to be fixed. I don't know how trust is going to be rebuilt in our institutions, in our universities, in politics. We have a long way to go. Things it seems like in the past 5, 10 years have really shifted. The landscape is completely shifted. But I think the way we start is by admitting what's wrong. I think if we were to say that trust, which some people in my industry have said in my own newsroom, that no, people do trust us. No, they don't trust us. They don't actually trust
Mm.
the news. It's a real problem. And I think
Yep.
we have to admit these things in politics, even in leadership. In businesses, leaders have to understand that they are at a different. They're looking at things from a different viewpoint than their people who are front facing, for example. So if we admit that, and if we admit that we don't know, that's the only way I think that we can move forward in creating um, a more trusting society, more cohesion. I really think this is the key, and that's why I've left. I've left to talk about this, to explore this, to
Mhm.
write a book on this, because I've seen it. I've seen the difference between people who are authentic and people who aren't. I've seen success. I've seen failure through all the thousands of interviews I've done. And the one key thing that links it all together for me, for people who have been successful, for people who have fulfilled their dreams, is this authenticity, is being real.
Mm.
There's such a difference. So that's why I'm doing this type of work.
I hear that. It's that being real, and I think the thing, and I think you and I both said this in our when we were chatting a few weeks ago. It's like we all have that spidey sense.
Mhm.
Like we know when somebody is being real, and I think we just witnessed some of that here in Canada through our own election process, and like we saw quite a turnaround in that, and I mean, who knows whether
Mm.
we're right or wrong, like politics are what they are. But I think what we saw, what happened here in Canada was part of that that spidey sense of who do I trust?
Mhm.
Who do I trust? Because
Mhm.
I think it was less about what party are they for and really came down to who do I trust? Who feels most real, most in some ways vulnerable,
Yeah.
authentic?
And the one who was trying to kind of change who he was, right? To
We
present
felt
something
that.
different, because I'm sure there were, like, lots of, consultants and whatever saying that you should change, you should be like this. You can't people know that, like, they
They
see
know.
that. They're not dumb. They read it right away. People know right
And
away.
the thing about that is that it's not like, sometimes we're told we need to change, we need to do this and that, whatever, for whatever reason. But it's not that that person is bad or even untrustworthy.
Mhm.
It's that they're in a process, like somebody is saying, and it's like what happened to you, which is you need to be someone who other than who you naturally show
Are at
up
your
as.
core, yeah.
And we, as the receiver of that, feel it, and we then don't trust you because we don't know what's going
Yeah.
on. We just know something's going on. And so it's not that that person isn't trustworthy, but we, in absence of data and fact,
You have that spidey sense, right?
yeah, we go, "I don't know, there's something
Yeah,
going
and then
on
it
there,"
turns into an us versus them. It's like, "Why
Yeah,
are you hiding this? What are you hiding from me? What's your purpose? What's your end goal here?" And that leads to animosity. So I think it's like, generally, in order to create that cohesion and that collaboration and to get rid of that trust deficit or make it less or, disengagement, burn it, like, I think it all kinda ties together because we
mm,
feel like we have to put a shell on, that we're in a society that rewards those at the top and then throws away the rest, right? And so we can't be vulnerable. We feel like we can't be vulnerable, but we have to kinda change that.
yeah, and yet we have to be because it is the only vulnerability, authenticity, those are the only things that are really working in a world where trust is being rebuilt and where we are navigating our way through a changing landscape.
Mhm.
Without, those trust pillars, that have helped us in the past because everything has changed. We just don't have the infrastructure anymore that we can go to and say, "Well, that
Mhm.
is the thing I can trust,"
Yeah.
you know? And so it's a different world.
Mhm.
Farah, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I heard you say you're speaking, you're writing, you're doing interesting things. Where can our listeners keep in touch with you?
I'm on social media. I'm on all the different social medias, so you can look me up at Farah Nasser, and I have a website, farahNasser.com, if you want to get in touch.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. This has been incredible, and I can't wait to read your book, first of all, and would love to continue this conversation because I think that what you're doing is you're really giving so many of us, especially women, a new way to look at what we do and how we show up in the world. So thank
I
you.
hope so. Thank you. That's the goal.
Farah's honesty and authenticity in this conversation was something that I felt privileged to be able to hear and facilitate. She shared her true vulnerability as she walked away from a career that she had spent her entire life building. But it wasn't about what she walked away from, but rather what she's walking towards. We're taught that success means staying in roles, staying in rooms, staying silent. But what if success is really about that internal alignment with who we are authentically? What if success is about finding the place where your voice, your values, and your presence are what is most important? That success might be in a job, or it might be in finding something completely different that you never thought you would be doing. Farah gave us a new model because she didn't just leave a job, she reclaimed herself. And by doing that, she showed us a new kind of leadership that's rooted in truth, authenticity, and even transparency, and had very little to do with performance. Now, if this episode helped you reflect on your own story, go ahead and share it with someone who might also need to hear it. And don't forget, subscribe for more conversations that challenge the scripts we've been given and help us find the courage to write new ones. I'm Andrea Sampson, and this has been Sense Making Conversations.